This is the Breaker.News podcast for the week of March 22nd, 2020. I'm Bob Mackin, publisher of theBreaker.News and host of the Breaker.News podcast. Welcome to edition number 126. The Breaker is your source for news, opinion, and analysis about British Columbia issues, institutions, and influencers. Later, I'll tell you how you can support the Breaker. On this edition, coronavirus headlines from the Pacific Rim and Pacific Northwest, the Is It Just Me commentary, the Big Deal feature, a recap of the week that a state of emergency was declared in British Columbia, and the Canada-US border was closed to all but essential services. And I chat with journalism professor Sean Holman about why we need more transparency, not less, during the coronavirus emergency. I will also award a virtual Dynamo bar to those who are making a difference. Now, is it just me? Is it just me, or did you ever think that in your lifetime you would see the border between Canada and the United States close? That happened when March 20th turned into March 21st. Only essential service vehicles and workers may cross the 49th parallel until who knows when. On the inside of the monument, beside the embedded gates at the Peace Arch crossing, are the words, "May these gates never be closed." Measures inspired by China because of a virus from China have led to the symbolic closure of these gates to average Canadians and Americans. The Peace Arch also says brethren dwelling together in unity. But brethren are now socially distanced. Socially distanced because of the Communist Party of China, which silenced the warnings of the brave whistleblower doctors of Wuhan many months ago. When this pandemic is all over, and it will pass, the world must unite to find a peaceful way to break down the walls of the world's biggest prison and bring democracy and human rights to China, including, most importantly, a free press. What do you think? Email bob@thebreaker.news. Wuhan Coronavirus Pandemic 2020. Now it's time on the Breaker.News podcast for Around the Rim. We look at coronavirus news from around the Pacific Rim. In the Taiwan news, Keone Everington reports, "It isn't my job to flatter China," Taiwan Foreign Minister. In response to an editorial by Xinhua News accusing Taiwan of hating China and fawning over the U.S., Foreign Minister Joseph Wu said, "It isn't my job to flatter China." Wu said that as the COVID-19 pandemic continues to worsen, Taiwan and the U.S. will further strengthen cooperative consultation mechanisms to fight against the disease. His comment could be interpreted by some as a jab at the World Health Organization Director General Tedros Adhanom, who has been criticized for obsequiously lavishing praise on Communist China's handling of the pandemic, despite the country's complete lack of transparency. Zhang Pingwei in the South China Morning Post reports, coronavirus concern in Wuhan community over suspected asymptomatic case. There were 41 new cases recorded on March 20th in the mainland, all of them imported from overseas, including 14 patients in Beijing, 9 in Shanghai, and 7 in Guangdong. Authorities said a 62-year-old man was tested for the pneumonia-like illness 3 times. He was negative on Tuesday, positive on Thursday, when he was admitted to hospital, but tested negative again on Friday. In the Japan Times, Yoshiaki Nohara and Yukio Takeo report Japan could face year-long slump if cursed Olympics cancelled. Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's administration and the International Olympic Committee have tried to damp down growing speculation that the Games won't be held as scheduled, as lockdowns of cities across the world cast doubt on the ability of athletes and visitors to attend the sports spectacle. Finance Minister Taro Aso on Wednesday characterized 2020 as another cursed year, citing the war-cancelled 1940 Olympics and the boycotted Moscow Olympics in 1980 as examples. A Bloomberg survey of economists predicts a 0.5% slowdown in Japan's economy. That's this coronavirus edition of Around the Rim on this edition of the Breaker.News podcast. Now it's time on the Breaker.News podcast for a coronavirus edition of Cascadia Calling. We look at coronavirus news from around the Pacific Northwest. In the Bellingham Herald, David Rosbach reports, how could closing the U.S.-Canada border for coronavirus impact Whatcom's economy? The Border Policy Research Institute found that Canadians comprise approximately 75% of cross-border travelers, depending on the exchange rate. In 2018, that would have represented approximately 10.5 million southbound Canadian travelers through the Blaine, Linden, Sumas, and Point Roberts points of entry. Those Canadians represent a large portion of consumers in Whatcom County, averaging 17%, but in some weekends, there are almost half of the consumers. A disproportionate share make quick trips across the border to hit gas stations and pick up mail-order purchases at smaller retailers in Blaine, Linden, and Sumas. In the Oregonian, Rob Davis reports, best way to track coronavirus severity? Hospitalizations. Oregon stopped reporting them. The Oregon Health Authority this week stopped publicly reporting how many patients are hospitalized with the deadly virus, making it impossible for the public to track the growing severity of the novel coronavirus. Oregon is giving the public less information about its test results than neighboring Washington. Though Governor Brown pledged transparency in the state's response, the Oregon Health Authority isn't saying how many people older than 80 have tested positive, the group experts consider the most at risk. Oregon instead lumps together everyone older than 55. Though Oregon tracks occupancy and hospitals reported, health authority officials won't say how full the state's hospitals currently are, even with an unprecedented effort underway to free up beds. Its officials didn't answer repeated questions about how many hospital beds are currently available. And these coronavirus headlines in theBreaker.news this week. Exclusive. Despite state of emergency, Vancouver City Hall goes ahead with mayor's elevator revamp. Richmond ICBC staff call Mounties over coronavirus fear. State of emergency affects British Columbians' right to know. And an exclusive. Chinese traveler suspected of both money laundering and coronavirus after YVR arrival. Read the stories behind these headlines. Go to theBreaker.news. Big Deal feature on the Breaker.news podcast. In British Columbia, the Ministry of Health was reporting daily updates on a case-by-case basis about the coronavirus outbreak. The information was anonymized and included the approximate age of a patient, the health region, the gender, how the virus was spread, either by travel or to a certain country or in the community, and also the status of the patient. All that information was released while still respecting patient confidentiality. The last time that was disclosed to reporters and the public was March the 12th. In the meantime, the Information and Privacy Commissioner has allowed public bodies across BC to take an extra month to answer FOI requests. That means up to 90 business days. Meanwhile, the law includes a rarely used public interest override that says information must be released if a significant risk to public health exists, and it does right now. But public bodies are not following that direction. I'm joined by Sean Holman, a professor of journalism at Mount Royal University in Calgary. Sean, why do we need more transparency in a time of crisis, a time of disaster, and in this case, a time of disease?
Well, it's important to understand first why we value information in the first place in democracies. And really, there's two main reasons. The first is control, the idea that with information we can make better decisions about the world around us, and thereby control public and private institutions. And the second reason we value information is certainty. It allows us to feel more certain, especially during uncertain times. And that certainly is the case today. So if we think about those two reasons, that's really why we want more information about what exactly is going on when it comes to this particular public health crisis, because we can then better evaluate whether or not public bodies are doing the jobs that they should be doing when it comes to protecting us from disease, when it comes to protecting us from COVID-19, and we can then feel more certain about the fact that that job is actually being done. So transparency is more essential than ever before.
We are seeing cases where some doctors, there's a doctor over in Courtenay on Vancouver Island who has gone on the record with CTV News Vancouver Island saying that she thinks that not only should there be more disclosure of cases by health authority, but they should actually be geographic by municipality, that the more people know about the cases around them, the more likely they are then to practice the strictly recommended social distancing, for example. That's one case, one reason why one doctor is waving the red flag and hoping for more transparency. Of course, the information that was released here in British Columbia until March 12th was anonymized. Privacy was respected. In the province of Ontario, their health ministry is releasing the same type of information. Again, it's anonymized, but it's allowing people to know better what is going around them and how the authorities are managing this crisis.
Absolutely, and I think the doctor you cite actually is correct, right? Because if people can get a better sense about how much infection there is in their local geographic area, they can act accordingly. And we really do want people to, in this time of crisis, be acting in accordance to the risk around them. We want people to be self-isolating. We want people to be socially distancing. And we want people to be thinking about the larger community as opposed to simply their own individual safety. And by disclosing that kind of information, we can allow for those kinds of measures. And we also saw recently that Maclean's magazine was frustrated in getting that kind of information. They approached the federal government asking to see if they could get a province-by-province breakdown on the growth of COVID-19 cases across the country. And the federal government refused because the federal government believed that that information belonged to the provinces and wasn't theirs to share. And that's really troubling and really problematic. We want to get a better sense about how governments are responding to this particular issue, what measures are effective, what measures aren't effective. And we want to be able to hold to account public bodies that are not doing enough to maintain the safety of those under their care. And an indication of growth of COVID-19 would be a strong suggestion that maybe more should be done. So this really is vitally important that we get this kind of information as soon as possible, and the media is able to share it as soon as possible with the public.
This is the biggest contemporary emergency since 9/11, since the September 11th of 2001 terrorist attacks. The cities that were the epicenter, where the most damage was felt because of the terrorist attacks, it took them days, weeks, and months in some cases to get back to normal, but really, if things were functioning within a matter of weeks, away from the actual epicenter of the attacks, here we have a complete shutdown of our cities, of our economy, orders to stay home in some parts of North America. Those orders are backed up by law. We do have states of emergency declared in various jurisdictions. That means that if our governments want to, they can suspend our civil rights. The governments are trying to continue to function, but there's also other issues that we can be worried about. Civil liberties is one, and the other is, again, you alluded to it before, whether they're actually upholding their responsibilities. And also what's going on behind the scenes, because there could be some malicious actors involved in waste and corruption.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And to a certain extent, we won't find some of that information out until this crisis is over. But in the near term, we really do want to try to facilitate access to as much information as possible. Because as you mentioned, Bob, these kinds of situations also open to the door to all kinds of abuses. We have seen time and time again governments across liberal democracies where people take advantage of crises to put in place measures that might not be necessarily advantageous to everyone, and certainly aren't advantageous to democratic norms. So we really want to be careful of that, especially at a time when a lot of liberal democracies are under threat from extremist right-wing parties.
And the other risk we have now is that business is basically being done from home in many cases, and that includes government business. And there's the concern of security of information, about keeping the databases that hold private information about citizens safe and secure from, on one hand, theft, the other hand, cyber attack. That's a story that I'm keeping an eye on as well, because this is an extraordinary time, and this has happened so rapidly that there may not have been the checks and balances necessary enacted in order to keep information secure, because that's the other side of the coin. We've got the information side of the coin, we've got the privacy side, the other side of the coin.
Yeah, and that's, again, another legitimate concern, Bob. But I think we'll have to see how this all shakes out. The only thing we can do at this present moment in time is to be sure and keep pressure on governments to provide us with as much information as they have. We are in a democracy. We're not in a dictatorship, and governments need to recognize that. Governments need to involve people in the decision-making that is happening right now, as difficult as sometimes that may be. And the population deserves to know what their government knows, especially at a time of crisis, to evaluate whether or not their governments are making the right decisions for the safety of all.
And finally, Sean, can you describe what life is like in Calgary today and this weekend?
Well, I've been socially isolating for the past 6 days or so. I developed a cough last week, so as a result, I decided, out of an abundance of caution, because 2 individuals I knew had potentially been exposed to COVID-19, that it was best for me to quarantine. My cough has gone away, but I'm continuing to socially isolate. So I don't know very much other than what I'm reading on the news, what I'm experiencing on social media, and the very limited inputs I get from the walls of my apartment. So I'm sure I'm not alone in that situation. I think a lot of us were going to need to get used to that kind of isolation. I know that's difficult on many people. I'm an introvert, so it doesn't bother me too much, but the world, for the most part, is made up of a lot of extroverts, and this is especially difficult on them.
Well, thank you again to Sean Holman, joining us from Calgary. Sean Holman, Professor of Journalism at Mount Royal University, on the Breaker.News podcast. A week of emergencies in British Columbia as governments gave themselves more power amid the coronavirus pandemic crisis. At first, Vancouver Mayor Kennedy Stewart said he would not declare a state of local emergency in Vancouver. Here is what he said on March 16th to the media.
At this point, we don't see a need operationally to declare a state of emergency. You can imagine a number of things happen when you do that. But if we did do it, it would really centralize power in the city, allowing us to take extraordinary measures, like, say, for example, procure hotel space, to deliver clothing, to deliver food, to disperse groups of people. So it really is the top level we can go to.
2 days later, Kennedy Stewart changed his tune after some restaurants and pubs ignored the ban on St. Patrick's Day parties.
After taking the best advice from health officials, Fire Chief Darrell Reed, and Police Chief Adam Palmer, I have decided we need to declare a state of emergency in Vancouver. As such, I have called a virtual special council meeting tomorrow morning where I'll ask council to formally endorse my decision. This declaration will give our city the tools it needs to move faster and keep residents and businesses safe.
The state of emergency means City Hall can acquire land or personal property, buy clothing and equipment and essential supplies, and also restrict the use or occupancy of a building or land in the city. On March 17th, Premier John Horgan gave his dim assessment of St. Patrick's Day 2020, and he reiterated Health Minister Adrian Dix's public call to close the border to tourists to stop the spread of coronavirus.
I understand when it comes to logistics chains and supply lines, the relationship between Canada and the United States is critically important from coast to coast, right along the 49th parallel. But we are very concerned, and Minister Dix was categorical yesterday, and I fully support that position, that if people are coming to visit, if they're coming to Butchart Gardens, it's best to come in August, not to come in April. And that's a message that we had hoped the federal government, and quite frankly, the federal government supports that. But we also need to be sure that we keep our lines of trade open, not for any other reason, to make sure that our shelves are stocked, the food that we do import has access, and those critical to the functioning of our economy, our healthcare system, and a whole host of other issues have free access. People will make their choices, Tanya, as to whether they want to go out and participate in the economy. It's St. Patrick's Day. It'll be the worst St. Patrick's Day ever, I expect, in terms of the hospitality sector, which depends on this day to be a boost for sales. Well, it's not going to happen, but that doesn't mean we can't find other ways in the days and, well, more importantly, the weeks and months ahead to try and find ways to encourage people to get back into the economy, to help support those businesses that they've been depending on many times, as with my barber, for a long, long time. I don't want to see her fail because she's not seeing people come in the door. Similarly, in the hospitality sector and restaurants, beverage houses, places where people like to congregate, today is not the day to do that, but that's not to say that day is not far off. And we need to be mindful that we have to get out there at the appropriate time when it's safe to do so, and keep buying BC products, supporting BC businesses. I know that public wants to do that, and when the time is right, we'll certainly be working with Dr. Henry and Minister Dix to make sure the public fully understands when they should dive right in.
Also on March 17th, Provincial Health Officer Dr. Bonnie Henry declared a public health emergency. Henry now has the power to issue both written and verbal orders and involve police to help enforce her orders.
Today, in addition, we have taken the extra step of declaring a public health emergency in the province of British Columbia. This is something that, as you know, we've had as a tool in our toolkit for some time, and I felt that today was the tool. This is the tool that we need now. We've taken a number of unprecedented measures in the last few days, and this declaration of an emergency enables me to be faster, more streamlined, and nimble in the things that we need to do right now.
On March 18th, Solicitor General Mike Farnworth joined the emergency parade when he invoked the Emergency Program Act. It gives the province the power to restrict movement in the province, fix prices and ration goods, and also to enter buildings without a warrant.
At this juncture, we need to ensure that we will continue to have the means to coordinate our response across government, across industry, and that we have the tools available to protect the most vulnerable. That is why, today, based on the recommendations of BC's health and emergency management officials, and following Dr. Bonnie Henry's declaration of a public health emergency, I am declaring a provincial state of emergency to support our provincial health officer and Minister of Health in swift and powerful response to the COVID-19 pandemic. This declaration will make sure federal, provincial, and local resources are delivered in a joint, coordinated way to protect the people of our province. This is an all-hands-on-deck approach.
On March 18th, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and President Donald Trump agreed to close the border except for essential services and trade.
Hello, Mr. Trudeau. It's Annie Bergeron-Oliver from CTV National News. I'm just wondering, what assurances do you have from President Trump that if this pandemic gets worse, he will not close the borders, crippling trade and necessary shipments in Canada? And also, how long do you expect this temporary closure to last? Will it be weeks? Are you planning for months?
We talked about exactly that this morning, President Trump and I, to ensure that indeed our economies and our people that are so interconnected in so many different ways will be able to ensure the smooth flow of goods and essential materials and medication across the border. That is something that we remain committed to. We will work in close collaboration on an ongoing basis to make sure that that continues. And these measures will last in place as long as we feel that they need to last. We will, again, closely coordinate on that as well.
The first one on the Canadian border. What was the tipping point? Friday we talked about it, and Monday you said no, we're not considering closing.
No, I said
the border.
not yet. I spoke with the Prime Minister, Trudeau. Very good relationship, obviously, between us and our two countries. And no tipping point. It's just that we want to isolate from the standpoint we don't want people coming into contact, because that's the way we're going to win this war. That is so important. And we both thought it was time. Now, it's not affecting trade. It's non-essential. It's non-essential crossings. It won't affect trade at all. And it was just something we thought would be good for both countries. Yes.
Trudeau had floated the idea that the Emergencies Act could be invoked. The BC Civil Liberties Association called upon the government for restraint amid the crisis because previous versions of the law were used for arbitrary arrest. Stay tuned. May 3rd, 1986, the Expo Theatre in Vancouver. The Expo 86 Gala, broadcast by the CBC. A star-studded night that featured local success story Bryan Adams, and it was hosted by comedian Howie Mandel. On the bill was chart-topping country superstar Kenny Rogers, who died this week at age 81. The month after the 10th anniversary of the Vancouver Olympics, let's go back in the podcast time machine to the second day of Expo 86, when Kenny Rogers performed for Prince Charles and Princess Diana in the Expo Theatre by the shores of False Creek in downtown Vancouver.
Tonight, in the presence of the Prince and Princess of Wales, a gala evening at Expo 86. Starring Bryan Adams, Sheena Easton, Loverboy, and Kenny Rogers, with special guests Veronique Beliveau and Idolize. And now, your host for this evening, Howie Mandel.
Hi. To the people of the world, welcome to a gala evening at Expo 86.
Coming up next, Kenny Rogers on a gala evening at Expo 86.
Oh, I can't tell you why I love her. I don't even know my story. All I know is she gives me feelings I can't wait for anyone. She told me that please only fly. I don't know how she does it. I guess she does it magically. She's the best to me.
First of all, let me say thank you very much to Expo 86 for including me in this as a non-Canadian. I think it's quite an honor to be a part of this. And quite honestly, country singers don't get to sing for the royal family every day. So that's pretty special as well. This, to me, is one of the most beautiful songs I've ever heard. Lionel Richie wrote this song, and it's very special for what I think is a very special lady as well. Lady, I'm your knight, shining armor, and I love you. You have made me what I am. I am yours. My love, there's so many ways I want to say I love you. Let me hold you in my arms forevermore.
The virtual Nanaimo Bar brought to you by Spruce Hill Contracting. Every week we end the Breaker.News podcast on a tasty note by awarding the goodness of a virtual Nanaimo bar to a person or group that is making a difference. A virtual version of the province's favorite dessert bar goes this week to the doctors, the nurses, the paramedics, the first aid attendants, anesthesiologists, x-ray technicians, support staff of all types, the healthcare workers of British Columbia who are on the front lines of the battle against the novel coronavirus. You are in our hearts and you are in our minds. May all of you have all the strength and all the grace that you need to get through this extraordinary time. Nominate someone for a virtual Nanaimo bar. Send us an email to bob@theBreaker.news. Spruce Hill Contracting, custom homes and renovations. Find more information at sprucehill.ca. That's it for the Breaker.News podcast for the week of March 22nd, 2020. I'm Bob Mackin. Thanks for joining me. Did you know that on March 22nd, it is the 78th birthday of IOC member Dick Pound of Montreal, and it's the 68th birthday of NBC sports broadcaster Bob Costas? Will Bob Costas broadcast from Tokyo this summer? Straight shooter Dick Pound was the first IOC bigwig to acknowledge that the Summer Olympic Games could be postponed by the coronavirus. Stay tuned. Now you know. Send me your feedback. Send me your story ideas to bob@theBreaker.news. Bookmark theBreaker.news. You can also find us at theBreaker.ca. Sign up for the email newsletter and get updates to your inbox. For news as it happens, follow The Breaker News on Twitter and visit theBreaker.news on Facebook. You can support The Breaker for as little as $2 a month. For more information, go to patreon.com/TheBreakerNews. patreon.com/TheBreakerNews. Until next week.